Hello, everyone. Today, we bring you a heart-touching story that highlights the incredible power of kindness and the strength of community. When young postman Alex Martin noticed something unusual about an elderly woman's home, he decided to act, a choice that changed both of their lives. Watch as a simple routine delivery transforms into a life-saving journey, showing how a single act of compassion can make all the difference. Remember to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to Life Story 999 for more inspiring stories. The early morning sun peeked over the horizon, bathing the small town of Hillcrest in a soft, golden glow. The quiet streets were still, with only a few early risers venturing out as the town slowly awakened. Alex Martin, a young postman, stood before his mirror, adjusting his blue postal uniform with careful hands. The eagle emblem embroidered on his chest filled him with a quiet sense of pride, a reminder that his job was more than just delivering letters. It was about connection. As Alex prepared for his daily route, he reflected on the comfort of his routine. There was something soothing about the predictable rhythm of his days. The creak of the post office door as he stepped inside, the familiar faces of his co-workers exchanging sleepy greetings, and the scent of fresh paper and ink from the sorted mail waiting for him. All of it made him feel like an essential part of Hillcrest fabric. Today was no different, or so he thought. He grabbed his bag of mail and keys to his postal van, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips as he mentally reviewed his route. Sliding into the driver's seat, Alex took a moment to appreciate the crispness of the morning air, tinged with the scent of blooming flowers and freshly cut grass. The streets of Hillcrest were like old friends, each corner and alley familiar, each house holding faces that had become a part of his life. Driving down the still quiet streets, Alex couldn't help but feel a sense of belonging. He waved to early risers as they collected their newspapers, exchanged nods with joggers, and greeted dog walkers with a smile. These small interactions, fleeting as they were what made his job worthwhile. They were the threads that wove his connection to the community, each moment unique and cherished in its own way. Hillcrest was more than just a delivery route. It was a community filled with stories, with people who relied on him. As he stopped at each house, handing over letters and packages, he thought of the families within. He knew the stories behind many of those doors: births, weddings, graduations, and even losses. He delivered sympathy cards, birthday wishes, and unexpected surprises. He understood that, in his own small way, he played a part in those stories. Arriving at his first stop on Elm Street, Alex glanced at his list of deliveries. Mrs. Green's name caught his eye, and a small smile appeared on his face. Mrs. Green was one of his favorites. She always greeted him warmly, her eyes crinkling with genuine interest in his day. It had been a while since he'd seen her, and he looked forward to their brief chat. She was one of the bright spots in his otherwise predictable day, a reminder that even in a job built on routine, there were moments of true connection. Little did Alex know, this routine delivery would soon lead him to a discovery that would change everything, not just for Mrs. Green, but for him as well. The comfort of his familiar morning was about to be disrupted, setting off a chain of events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about his quiet, peaceful route. Alex Martin pulled his postal van to a stop in front of Mrs. Green's house, his smile widening as he anticipated their usual brief but pleasant exchange. But as he stepped out of the van, something immediately felt off. The garden, usually so neatly tended, with blooming flowers and meticulously trimmed bushes, looked neglected. Weeds had begun to creep through the flower beds, and the grass was slightly overgrown. The sight made Alex hesitate, a flicker of concern crossing his mind. His eyes moved to the front steps, where a pile of newspapers sat, several days' worth, judging by their weathered and yellowing pages. Mrs. Green was usually diligent about bringing in her papers first thing in the morning. Alex frowned, an unease settling in his stomach. He approached the door, his boots crunching softly against the gravel path. As he reached the porch, he noticed the curtains were drawn tight, which was unlike Mrs. Green, who loved the morning sun streaming into her cozy living room. Taking a deep breath, Alex pressed the doorbell, the muffled chime echoing inside. He waited, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, glancing around at the eerily still property. A full minute passed, and there was no sound of movement from within. Frowning, Alex pressed the doorbell again, this time adding a few firm knocks on the door. He leaned closer, listening for any sign of life, a shuffle, a voice, but the house remained silent. He stepped back, uncertainty gnawing at him. It wasn't like Mrs. Green to ignore visitors, especially him. She was always so prompt, so cheerful, ready with a smile and a story about her garden or her cat, Whiskers. Alex glanced at the pile of newspapers again, and then at the mailbox, which was stuffed full of letters, some of which were beginning to spill out. Something was definitely wrong. Just as Alex was about to turn and leave, maybe come back later to check on her, he heard a faint sound, a creak. His heart skipped a beat, and he turned back to the door just in time to see it slowly opening. Mrs. Green stood there, her small frame barely filling the doorway. She looked nothing like the vibrant woman he remembered. Her silver hair was matted, her skin pale, and her clothes hung loosely on her frail frame. She seemed to sway slightly, her eyes unfocused. "Mrs. Green?" Alex asked gently, concern lacing his voice. "It's me, Alex. Your postman." Mrs. Green blinked, as if trying to place him. Her gaze was distant, her usually bright eyes dull. "Oh, Alex," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm fine, dear. Thank you." She tried to smile, but it came out as more of a grimace. Alex frowned, stepping closer. "Are you sure? You don't look well, Mrs. Green. Maybe I can help, or call someone for you." She shook her head, a bit of strength returning to her voice. No, I'm fine. Just a little tired, that's all." "Thank you, Alex." She clutched the edge of the door as if it was the only thing holding her up. Alex hesitated, every instinct telling him that something was very wrong. He wanted to push, to insist on helping her, but the way she was looking at him, pleading for him to leave it alone, made him pause. He forced a smile, nodding slowly. "Okay, Mrs. Green, but if you need anything at all, just call the post office. I'll come right over." Mrs. Green nodded weakly, her eyes already drifting away from him. She mumbled a thank you and slowly began to close the door. Alex watched as it shut with a soft click, leaving him standing on the porch, a knot of worry tightening in his chest. He turned, walking back down the path to his van, but he couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over him. He glanced back at the house once more, the curtains still drawn, the newspapers still scattered across the porch. Everything about it felt wrong. Mrs. Green had always been so lively, so full of warmth. The woman he had just seen was a shadow of that person, and it unsettled him deeply. Sliding into the driver's seat, Alex gripped the steering wheel, his mind racing. He knew he should probably call someone, maybe the police for a welfare check or even a neighbor, but what if he was overreacting? What if she really was just tired, as she said? He sighed, trying to shake off the feeling. He had other deliveries to make, and he couldn't afford to fall behind. Still, as he started the engine and pulled away from the curb, he found himself looking at her house in the rearview mirror, the sense of unease refusing to leave him. Throughout the rest of his route, Alex couldn't get Mrs. Green out of his mind. The image of her frail figure, the emptiness in her eyes, played over and over again, a constant loop of worry. He replayed every detail. The neglected garden, the newspapers, her unsteady stance. Each memory added to the weight in his chest, a nagging voice telling him that he couldn't just ignore what he had seen. By the time Alex finished his deliveries for the day, he had made up his mind. He couldn't just let it go. He owed it to Mrs. Green to make sure she was okay, even if it meant overstepping a little. As he parked his van back at the post office, he pulled out his phone, his fingers hovering over the screen. He knew the decision he was about to make could change everything, but his gut told him it was the right thing to do. With a deep breath, Alex dialed the non-emergency number, his heart pounding as he waited for the call to connect. He didn't know what would come of it, but he knew he couldn't just drive away and forget about the look in Mrs. Green's eyes. Sometimes, doing the right thing meant taking a risk, and Alex was ready to take that risk for Mrs. Green. Alex couldn't shake the gnawing worry that followed him after his unsettling encounter with Mrs. Green. The image of her frail form, the vacant look in her eyes, kept replaying in his mind, a constant reminder that something was wrong. He knew he couldn't ignore it. He needed to know more, to figure out if his concerns were justified or if he was just overreacting. It was with this determination that Alex decided to speak to one of Mrs. Green's neighbors. Later that afternoon, Alex returned to Elm Street, parking his van just a few houses down from Mrs. Green's. He spotted Mr. Thompson, her next-door neighbor, outside, pruning the roses in his front yard. Mr. Thompson was a retired teacher, always friendly, and the kind of person who kept an eye on the neighborhood. Alex approached him, offering a wave and a polite smile. "Good afternoon, Mr. Thompson," Alex greeted, trying to keep his voice light, though the worry still weighed heavily on him. Mr. Thompson looked up, squinting against the sun, and smiled in recognition. "Well, hello there, Alex. How are you doing today?" Alex hesitated, then decided to get straight to the point. "I'm okay, thank you, but I was wondering, have you seen Mrs. Green lately? I stopped by her house today and, well, she didn't look too well. It's been bothering me." Mr. Thompson's smile faded, replaced by a frown of concern. He leaned on his gardening shears, his brow furrowed. "You know, now that you mention it, I haven't seen Jane in weeks. She used to come out to tend her garden almost every day, but lately, nothing." He shook his head. "I thought maybe she was visiting family or wasn't feeling up to it. But it has been a while." Alex's stomach twisted at the confirmation. Weeks. Mrs. Green had been struggling alone for weeks, and no one had noticed, or at least no one had acted. He nodded slowly, trying to mask his growing unease. "I'm worried about her, Mr. Thompson. She didn't look good today. I offered to help, but she refused." Mr. Thompson sighed, his expression mirroring Alex's concern. "Jane's always been proud. She wouldn't ask for help even if she needed it. But it doesn't sit right with me either, Alex. Maybe we should do something." Alex nodded, grateful for Mr. Thompson's understanding. "I'm thinking of calling for a welfare check, just to make sure she's okay. I don't want to overstep, but..." Mr. Thompson placed a reassuring hand on Alex's shoulder. "You're doing the right thing, son. Sometimes we have to step in, even if it's uncomfortable. Better safe than sorry, especially when it comes to someone like Jane." That night, Alex found himself pacing his small apartment, the conversation with Mr. Thompson replaying in his mind. He looked at his phone on the coffee table, the screen dark but seeming to call out to him, urging him to act. He picked it up, staring at the numbers, his thumb hovering over the keypad. He thought about Mrs. Green's face, the way her eyes had looked at him, not really seeing the way she swayed in the doorway, the pride that had kept her from accepting his help. What if she truly was in danger and no one did anything? What if, by respecting her privacy, he was abandoning her when she needed help the most? Alex let out a long breath, his decision crystallizing. He dialed the non-emergency line, his heart pounding as he listened to the ringing. When the dispatcher picked up, he explained the situation, his voice steady but laced with worry. He gave them all the details, her frail appearance, the piled-up newspapers, the way she seemed lost. The dispatcher assured him that they would send someone to check on Mrs. Green. As Alex hung up, a mixture of relief and anxiety washed over him. He had done it. He had taken a step, not knowing what the outcome would be, but knowing he had done what he could. That night, sleep didn't come easily. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hoping that by morning he would hear that everything was fine, that Mrs. Green was okay. But deep down, Alex knew that whatever happened next, his life and Mrs. Green's had already begun to change. The next morning, Alex couldn't ignore the sense of unease that clung to him like a shadow. He had woken early, barely rested, the worry about Mrs. Green gnawing at his mind. He tried to distract himself, going through his morning routine, showering, making coffee, getting dressed. But his thoughts always circled back to the frail figure he had seen the day before. Something wasn't right, and he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Determined, Alex decided to go back to Elm Street before his postal shift began. He drove through the quiet morning streets, his hands gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly. As he approached Mrs. Green's house, the unease only deepened. The pile of newspapers was still on the doorstep untouched, and the curtains were drawn just as they had been before. It felt like the house itself was holding its breath. Alex parked his van and walked up the path to Mrs. Green's front door. He pressed the doorbell and knocked, each echo a heavy reminder of his growing fear. He waited, listening for any movement, any sound from within the house. But there was nothing, only silence. Alex's heart sank. He knew he couldn't leave it at that, not this time. He stepped back, taking in the state of the house, the garden, the newspapers. He could no longer convince himself that he was overreacting. He reached into his pocket for his phone, his hands trembling slightly as he unlocked it and dialed 911. His voice was calm but firm as he spoke to the dispatcher, explaining what he had seen: the neglected garden, the piled-up mail, the frail state of Mrs. Green, and her insistence that she was fine when she clearly wasn't. The dispatcher listened carefully, her voice reassuring as she told him they would send officers to perform a welfare check. Alex thanked her, ending the call, and stood there for a moment, staring at the house. He hoped he had made the right decision. He didn't want to overstep, but he also couldn't live with himself if something happened to Mrs. Green and he had done nothing. Minutes later, the sound of sirens broke the stillness of the morning. A police car turned onto the street, pulling up in front of Mrs. Green's house. Alex watched as two officers got out, their expressions focused as they approached him. He quickly introduced himself, explaining that he was the one who had called. "Thank you for letting us know," one of the officers said, giving Alex a nod. "We'll check on her now. If you could just step back and give us some space, we'd appreciate it." Alex nodded, stepping back to the sidewalk, his eyes never leaving the front door. He watched as the officers knocked, called out Mrs. Green's name, and waited for a response. When none came, they exchanged a glance, and one of them tried the door. It was locked. They moved with purpose, one officer heading around to the back of the house, while the other stayed at the front. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as Alex stood there, his heart pounding in his chest. He heard the faint sound of a window being opened, followed by the officer's voice calling out again. Then, a moment later, the front door finally opened from the inside. The officer at the back had managed to get in. "Sir, you can come over here," the officer at the front called to Alex, who hurried up the steps, his breath catching in his throat. The officer's face was serious, but there was no panic. "She's inside. She's conscious, but she's not in good shape. We have paramedics on the way." Alex felt a mix of emotions: relief that Mrs. Green was alive, fear for her condition, and a lingering sense of dread about what might have happened if he hadn't called. He nodded, his eyes searching for her through the open door. He caught a glimpse of Mrs. Green sitting in a chair, her face pale and her eyes distant. She looked even more fragile than she had the day before. Within minutes, the ambulance arrived, its lights flashing silently. The paramedics moved quickly, bringing in a stretcher and medical equipment. Alex stepped aside, watching as they assessed Mrs. Green, speaking to her in calm, reassuring tones. She seemed to respond, but her voice was too weak for Alex to hear. One of the paramedics turned to Alex as they prepared to take her to the hospital. "Are you family?" she asked, her expression kind. Alex shook his head. "No, I'm just her mailman. I was worried about her." The paramedic gave him a nod. "You did the right thing by calling. She needs medical attention, but she's stable for now." Alex swallowed, his throat tight. Will she be okay? It's hard to say right now, the paramedic replied honestly. But getting her to the hospital is the best thing for her. As they wheeled Mrs. Green out, Alex stepped forward, catching her eye for just a moment. She looked at him, her lips curling into the faintest hint of a smile, and she mouthed something. "Thank you." Alex felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. He nodded, his voice catching as he whispered, "You're welcome, Mrs. Green." He stood there on the porch, watching as they loaded her into the ambulance, the doors closing behind her. The siren wailed as the vehicle pulled away, disappearing down the street. Alex took a deep breath, the tension slowly easing from his body. He had done what he could. He had acted when it mattered, and for that, he was grateful. As he walked back to his van, Alex knew that this was not the end. He would visit Mrs. Green in the hospital, make sure she was okay. He wasn't just her mailman anymore. He was someone who cared, someone who would make sure she wasn't alone. The sirens echoed to the quiet neighborhood as the police car and ambulance pulled up in front of Mrs. Green's house. Alex stood on the sidewalk, his heart pounding as he watched the officers and paramedics move quickly into action. He had done what he could, and now it was out of his hands. All he could do was wait and hope that Mrs. Green would be all right. The two police officers approached the house first, one heading around back while the other knocked on the front door. They called out her name, their voices firm but calm. When there was no answer, the officer at the back managed to find an open window and climbed inside, disappearing from Alex's view. Moments later, the front door creaked open and the officer beckoned the paramedics to enter. Alex's breath caught as he watched them disappear into the house. The minutes felt like hours as he stood there, his eyes fixed on the doorway, his heart heavy with worry. He tried to listen for any sound, anything that might tell him what was happening inside, but all he heard was the muffled movement of footsteps. The air seemed to grow colder as time stretched on, and Alex felt a growing sense of dread. Finally, he saw them. The paramedics emerged from the house, wheeling Mrs. Green out on a stretcher. Alex's stomach dropped at the sight of her. She looked even worse than before. Her skin was pale, her eyes closed, and her frail body seemed almost swallowed by the blankets wrapped around her. The oxygen mask over her face only heightened the reality of how dire her condition had become. Alex moved closer, his eyes never leaving Mrs. Green. He wanted to say something, to reassure her somehow, but words failed him. He felt a mixture of relief and fear, relief that she was still alive, fear for what might happen next. One of the paramedics glanced in his direction, and Alex quickly stepped aside to give them space as they wheeled her towards the ambulance. "Is she going to be okay?" Alex found himself asking, his voice barely above a whisper. One of the paramedics paused, offering him a sympathetic look. "She's in rough shape, but she's stable for now. We're taking her to the hospital to get her the care she needs. You did the right thing by calling us." Alex nodded, swallowing hard as he watched them lift Mrs. Green into the ambulance. He caught a glimpse of her face as they did, a fleeting moment where her eyes opened just a sliver. She looked at him, her gaze filled with something he couldn't quite place. Gratitude, perhaps, or maybe just recognition. Her lips moved slightly beneath the oxygen mask, and though he couldn't hear her, Alex felt that she was trying to say thank you. Tears pricked at the corners of his eyes as he stepped back, allowing the paramedics to close the doors. The siren wailed as the ambulance pulled away, disappearing down the street. Alex stood there, the sound fading into the distance, and took a deep breath, the tension slowly releasing from his body. He had done what he could. He had acted when it mattered, and for that, he was grateful. One of the police officers approached him, breaking Alex out of his thoughts. "Thank you for calling this in," the officer said, his tone sincere. "You may have saved her life today." Alex nodded, his throat tight. "I just couldn't ignore it. She's a good person. She didn't deserve to be left like that." The officer gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "You did the right thing. Not everyone would have taken the time to notice, let alone act. It shows you care, As the officer returned to the house to finish his work, Alex found himself standing there, looking at Mrs. Green's front door. It was still ajar, the dark interior of the house visible from where he stood. It looked empty, almost hollow. The vibrant life that once filled it was gone, replaced by silence and neglect. Alex knew that this wasn't the end of his connection with Mrs. Green. He would visit her at the hospital, make sure she was getting the care she needed. She wasn't just another name on his delivery route anymore. She was someone he cared about, someone he would fight for. He turned and walked back to his van, the weight of the morning settling heavily on his shoulders. As he started the engine, he glanced back at the house one last time. It felt different now. No longer just a house on his route, but a place where something important had happened, a place where he had made a difference. Driving away, Alex knew he would carry this moment with him. It wasn't often that his job brought him to these kinds of crossroads, where he had to make a choice that could change someone's life. But today he had chosen to act, and because of that, Mrs. Green had a chance. And for Alex, that was enough. After Mrs. Green was taken to the hospital, Alex felt a hollow ache settle in his chest. He returned to his postal route, but his thoughts were consumed with worry. He couldn't shake the image of her frail body on the stretcher, her pale face, and the way she had looked at him, like he was her last hope. He wondered over and over if he should have done more, if he should have acted sooner. Maybe if he had called for help the first time he saw something was wrong, she wouldn't be in such a critical state now. The guilt gnawed at him, an unwelcome companion through every stop and delivery that day. The letters and packages he handed over felt heavier than usual, weighed down by his own troubled thoughts. He replayed each moment, questioning his actions and whether he had waited too long. It was a restless day, and by the time his shift ended, Alex knew he couldn't just go home and pretend everything was fine. Instead, he drove to the hospital, the same one where the ambulance had taken Mrs. Green earlier. The parking lot was crowded, and Alex had to circle twice before finding a spot. He walked in, his heart pounding, feeling both hopeful and afraid of what he might hear. He approached the front desk, asking about Mrs. Green, his voice almost a whisper. The nurse at the desk checked her records and looked up at him, her expression softening. "She's in the ICU," she said. "Her condition is critical, but she's stable for now. You're not family, are you?" Alex shook his head. "No, I'm her mailman. I wanted to know if she was okay." The nurse gave him a small smile. "You did a good thing by calling for help. She needed immediate attention, and getting her here may have saved her life." Hearing those words brought a wave of relief that nearly buckled Alex's knees. He exhaled slowly, feeling some of the tension ease from his body. He had done something right. Maybe not perfectly, maybe not as quickly as he should have, but he had acted when it mattered most. And that had made a difference. "Can I see her?" he asked, his voice hesitant. He didn't know if Mrs. Green would even want to see him, but he needed to know she wasn't alone. The nurse shook her head gently. "Not right now. Only family can visit the ICU. But if you leave a message, I can make sure she gets it when she's feeling better." Alex nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He scribbled a quick note on the paper she handed him. "Mrs. Green, I'm thinking of you. You're not alone. Get better soon. Alex." He handed it back to the nurse, offering her a grateful smile. As he walked out of the hospital, he felt a mix of emotions: worry for Mrs. Green, hope that she would recover, and a lingering guilt that he couldn't quite let go of. But he also felt something else, something that gave him strength, the knowledge that he had been there when it mattered. And for now, that was enough. A few days later, Alex received word that Mrs. Green had improved enough to receive visitors. He wasted no time driving to the hospital, his heart racing with anticipation and relief. As he entered the hospital room, he found Mrs. Green sitting up in bed, her face still pale but showing signs of recovery. Her eyes brightened when she saw him, a small but genuine smile spreading across her lips. "Alex," she said, her voice weak but warm. "I didn't think I'd see you again." Alex stepped closer, his heart swelling with emotion. "Of course you'd see me again, Mrs. Green. I had to make sure you were okay." He pulled a chair closer to her bedside, sitting down and meeting her gaze. "How are you feeling?" Mrs. Green sighed, her eyes glistening. "Better, thanks to you. The doctor said if you hadn't called for help, I might not have made it." She paused, her voice trembling slightly. "I was scared, Alex. I didn't know how to ask for help. I felt so alone, and I didn't want to burden anyone." Alex shook his head, his throat tightening. "You're never a burden, Mrs. Green. We all need help sometimes. I just wish I had acted sooner." Tears welled in Mrs. Green's eyes, and she reached out, taking his hand in hers. "You did more than anyone else would have, Alex. I'm so grateful. I was ashamed to admit I needed help, but you saw through it, and you came for me. Thank you." Alex felt his own eyes begin to sting, and he gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "You don't have to thank me. I'm just glad you're okay. And from now on, you're not alone. I'll be here whenever you need me." Mrs. Green's smile widened and she nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You're a good man, Alex. I'm lucky to have you in my life." For a moment, the room was filled with a comforting silence, a shared understanding between them. What had started as a simple connection between a postman and a resident had deepened into something far more meaningful. They were no longer just acquaintances. They were friends, bound by a shared experience that had brought them closer. Alex spent the rest of his visit chatting with Mrs. Green, sharing stories from his postal route, making her laugh with anecdotes about the people and pets he encountered each day. He could see the color slowly returning to her cheeks, her spirit lifting with each passing moment. It was as if his presence gave her strength, and in turn, she gave him a sense of purpose. When it was time for him to leave, Alex stood, promising to return soon. Mrs. Green's eyes followed him, her smile lingering. "I'll be waiting, Alex. And thank you for everything." Alex nodded, his heart full. "Take care, Mrs. Green. I'll see you soon." As he walked out of the hospital, Alex felt lighter than he had in days. He knew that this was only the beginning of their friendship. He had found someone worth fighting for, and that made all the difference. The days following Mrs. Green's hospitalization marked a significant change in Alex's life. He began visiting her every day after his shift, and each visit deepened his understanding of the silent struggles many elderly people face. Mrs. Green's experience opened his eyes in ways he never anticipated. He realized just how isolating life could be for someone without family or a support system, and it left a mark on him that he knew he couldn't ignore. Every time Alex walked into Mrs. Green's hospital room, he noticed the joy that lit up her face. It wasn't just because she was recovering physically. It was the comfort of having someone there. It dawned on Alex that this was something many elderly people long for, not just medical care, but genuine connection, a sense that someone cared about them. He saw how much it meant to Mrs. Green, and he couldn't help but think about the others like her, hidden in the corners of the community, waiting for someone to notice. During their conversations, Mrs. Green began to open up more about her life. She told Alex about her late husband, how they had dreamed of growing old together in the house that she now lived in alone. She spoke of the friends she had lost over the years, her voice tinged with sadness and nostalgia. Alex listened, his heart aching for her, but also feeling a warmth in the way she trusted him with her stories. He realized that what she had lost wasn't just her health, but the community she once had and the ability to ask for help without feeling like a burden. These conversations stayed with Alex even after he left the hospital each day. They replayed in his mind as he went about his postal route, and soon he found himself paying closer attention to the people he delivered to. He started noticing the small things, the neglected gardens, the overstuffed mailboxes, the curtains that remained closed day after day. He began knocking on doors a little more often, checking in on those who seemed to be slipping through the cracks. One day, after another visit with Mrs. Green, Alex found himself sitting in his van, staring out at the rows of houses that made up his route. He thought about how easy it was for people to get lost in their own lives, to overlook those who needed a helping hand simply because they weren't loud enough to ask for it. He decided then and there that he wanted to do more. It wasn't enough to just deliver the mail. He wanted to make sure that the people behind those doors were okay. Alex began speaking with his neighbors and other residents on his route, encouraging them to check in on each other. He talked to the younger families, asking them to keep an eye out for the elderly neighbors who might need a little help now and then. He spoke with the local community center, suggesting they organize regular wellness visits for the older residents in town. Slowly but surely, Alex began to see a shift. People were more attentive, more willing to lend a hand or simply say hello to someone they hadn't seen in a while. When Mrs. Green was finally discharged from the hospital, Alex was there to drive her home. She looked out the window as they passed through the streets of Hillcrest, her eyes widening as she saw familiar faces waving to her, smiles greeting her return. Alex had spoken to some of the neighbors beforehand, letting them know that Mrs. Green was coming home. He watched as tears filled her eyes and she reached over, squeezing his hand. "I never knew I mattered this much," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Thank you, Alex, for everything." Alex felt a lump rise in his throat, and he blinked back tears of his own. "You do matter, Mrs. Green, more than you know, and I promise, you're not alone anymore. None of us are." As he helped her settle back into her home, Alex felt a sense of fulfillment that was hard to put into words. He had always taken pride in his job, but now it felt like more than just a job. It was a chance to be part of something bigger, to be the connection that so many people needed. The bond he had formed with Mrs. Green had not only changed her life, it had transformed his own. The sense of community that had begun to take root in Hillcrest was something Alex wanted to nurture. He realized that even the smallest actions, a kind word, a knock on the door, an offer to help, could mean the world to someone who felt forgotten. And he knew, without a doubt, that he would continue to do whatever he could to keep that spirit alive, not just for Mrs. Green, but for everyone who needed it. It wasn't about grand gestures or heroic acts. It was about showing up, about caring enough to notice. And that, Alex knew, was how true change began. This story of Alex and Mrs. Green reminds us of the lasting impact of kindness. By acting on his instincts, Alex saved a life, demonstrating that compassion and community are our greatest strengths. Let's strive to care for those around us, as we never know who may need a helping hand. If you found this story inspiring, please share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Life Story 999 for more stories like this.